150 years ago, in an isolated plantation deep in Alabama's Black Belt, military records and local court documents mentioned a case so disturbing that it was buried in silence for generations. The Ashwood Manor plantation house stood as a testament to antebellum grandeur, but hidden within its walls lay a bedroom that became known as the bridal chamber of madness. Every woman who spent her wedding night in that room descended into insanity within months. Yet the pattern remained hidden until recently discovered archives revealed the horrifying truth. The disappearances, the silences, and the institutional cover-ups created a legacy of trauma that echoed through generations. Enslaved women who witnessed the horrors were silenced through violence and fear, while white society turned a blind eye to protect the reputation of one of Alabama's most prominent planting families. What began as whispered warnings among the enslaved community has now emerged as documented evidence of systematic cruelty disguised as tradition. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here, we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what has been silenced. Chapter 1. The Discovery. In early 2024, renovation work at what was once Ashwood Manor Plantation House in rural Sumter County, Alabama, uncovered more than rotting floorboards and crumbling plaster. Hidden beneath a false wall in the master bedroom, workers discovered a collection of letters, diary entries, and medical documents that had been sealed away for over a century. The papers, preserved by the dry conditions within the wall cavity, told a story that local historians had dismissed as folklore for generations. The documents belonged to Dr. Marcus Whitman, the plantation's private physician from 1847 to 1863. His meticulous records detailed a pattern so disturbing that it had been deliberately concealed from public view. According to Whitman's notes, 7 different brides had occupied the plantation's ornate master bedroom between 1848 and 1860. All 7 had been declared mentally unfit within 6 months of their wedding night. The bedroom itself was a masterpiece of antebellum architecture, featuring soaring 14-foot ceilings, elaborate plasterwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the plantation's manicured grounds. The room's centerpiece was an enormous mahogany 4-poster bed carved with intricate designs and draped in the finest silk imported from Charleston. To visitors, it represented the pinnacle of Southern aristocratic refinement, but Dr. Whitman's hidden records painted a different picture entirely. His first entry, dated September 15, 1848, described the mental collapse of Margaret Ashwood, the young bride of plantation owner Harrison Ashwood III. The patient exhibits severe melancholia, refusing all sustenance and speaking only of whispers in the walls, Whitman wrote. She claims to hear the voices of women pleading for release, though no such persons are present in the household. Margaret's deterioration was swift and complete. Within 3 months, she had been committed to the state asylum in Tuscaloosa, where she died 2 years later. The official cause of death was listed as brain fever, a common diagnosis used to disguise inconvenient truths about women's mental health in the antebellum period. Harrison Ashwood remarried within a year, bringing his second wife, Eleanor, to the same bedroom. Dr. Whitman's records show an identical pattern of psychological breakdown, with Eleanor exhibiting what he termed hysterical fits and paranoid delusions. She claimed to see bloodstains on the walls that disappeared when others looked and insisted that someone was drugging her food. The physician's notes reveal his growing suspicion about the room itself. I have begun to suspect that some element within the master chamber contributes to these afflictions, he wrote in March 1850. The similarity of symptoms across different patients suggests an environmental factor rather than inherited weakness of temperament. What Dr. Whitman didn't know was that his careful documentation was being monitored. Harrison Ashwood had been reading the physician's private notes, and he was determined to ensure that no word of the bedroom's dark reputation would spread beyond the plantation's boundaries. The pattern continued with each subsequent bride. Sarah, wife number 3, lasted only 2 months before attempting to set fire to the bedroom. She was quickly removed to an institution in Mobile, where she died under mysterious circumstances. Wife number 4, Catherine, was found wandering the plantation grounds at night, speaking to invisible companions and refusing to enter the main house. By 1855, Dr. Whitman had begun to piece together the true nature of what was happening at Ashwood Manor. His later entries described not mental illness, but deliberate psychological torture designed to drive the women insane. The bedroom had been fitted with hidden panels and concealed passages that allowed someone to enter and exit without detection. The enslaved women who worked in the main house knew the truth, but their testimonies were worthless in a society that refused to acknowledge their humanity. They had witnessed the midnight visits, the drugged wine, and the systematic psychological abuse that each bride endured. Their warnings went unheeded, and their silence was enforced through violence and the constant threat of sale to the deeper South. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Control. The master bedroom at Ashwood Manor was no accident of design. Harrison Ashwood III had commissioned the room's construction in 1847, just months before his first marriage, working with a Charleston architect who specialized in what were euphemistically called private domestic arrangements. The room's elaborate decorative elements served to disguise a more sinister purpose. It was designed as a chamber of psychological manipulation. Behind the ornate plasterwork and silk wallpaper lay a network of hidden passages and observation points that allowed someone to move through the walls undetected. The floorboards had been specially constructed with hollow spaces beneath, creating acoustic chambers that could amplify sounds and create the illusion of voices coming from within the walls themselves. Dr. Whitman's discovered notes include detailed sketches of the room's secret architecture, drawn during his clandestine investigations in 1856. The physician had grown increasingly disturbed by the pattern of mental breakdowns and had begun conducting his own examinations of the bedroom when the family was absent. What he found confirmed his worst suspicions about the deliberate nature of the women's suffering. The bed itself was a masterwork of hidden cruelty. Beneath the mahogany framework, Ashwood had installed a series of mechanisms that could create subtle movements and sounds during the night. Springs and pulleys, operated from the adjacent dressing room, could make the bed frame creak and shift without any visible cause. Small vials of various substances could be released through tiny openings in the headboard, creating strange odors and atmospheric effects. The windows, despite their grand appearance, had been fitted with specially designed glass that created optical illusions at certain times of day. When the light struck at particular angles, the windows would project shadowy figures that appeared to move across the walls. The effect was subtle enough to be dismissed as imagination by skeptical observers, but persistent enough to convince the room's occupants that they were being watched by invisible presences. Most insidious of all was the room's ventilation system. Behind the elaborate crown molding, Ashwood had installed a network of narrow pipes that connected to a storage area in the basement. Through these pipes, various substances could be introduced into the room's air supply. Mild hallucinogens derived from local plants, opium preparations, and other compounds that would affect the occupant's mental state without leaving obvious traces. The enslaved workers who maintained the house were intimately familiar with the room's secrets, but they were also the most vulnerable to punishment if they spoke. Celia, an enslaved woman who worked as a chambermaid, had witnessed Harrison Ashwood operating the room's hidden mechanisms during his second wife's residency. When she attempted to warn Eleanor about what was happening, she was sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana within days. The plantation's other enslaved residents developed a complex system of coded warnings to communicate about the dangers of the master bedroom. They would speak of the room that eats women, or warn each other that the walls have teeth. These phrases, meaningless to white listeners, conveyed the deadly, serious message that the bedroom was a place of intentional harm. Dr. Whitman's notes revealed that he had begun to understand the scope of the deception by 1857. The master has created not merely a bedroom, but an instrument of torture, he wrote. Every element of the chamber's design serves to undermine the occupant's grasp on reality, creating the appearance of madness where none previously existed. The physician's growing awareness of the truth put him in an impossible position. As a white professional man, he had both the credibility and the moral obligation to expose what was happening. But as an employee of Harrison Ashwood, he was bound by both financial dependence and the social codes that protected wealthy plantation owners from scrutiny. Chapter 3. The Pattern of Silence. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. By 1858, the pattern at Ashwood Manor had become too obvious to ignore, yet the machinery of silence continued to function with deadly efficiency. Dr. Marcus Whitman's private correspondence, discovered alongside his medical notes, reveals his growing desperation as he witnessed the systematic destruction of woman after woman. His letters to colleagues in Mobile and Montgomery describe his attempts to find allies who might help him expose the truth about the plantation's master bedroom. The responses to his inquiries were uniformly discouraging. Dr. James Morrison of Mobile wrote back, "While your concerns may be medically sound, the reputation of established families must be protected from unfounded speculation. I would advise focusing your attention on more conventional cases of female hysteria." The message was clear. The medical establishment would not support any investigation that might threaten the social order. Meanwhile, the enslaved community at Ashwood Manor had developed their own methods of resistance and protection. Led by an older woman named Ruth, who had served as midwife and healer for the plantation's enslaved population, they began documenting the truth in their own way. Ruth kept a coded record of events, using symbols and markings that would be meaningless to white observers, but preserved the essential facts for posterity. Ruth's records, discovered in 2023 during archaeological excavations of the former slave quarters, provide the most detailed account of what actually occurred in the master bedroom. Written in a mixture of English and West African symbols, on pieces of bark and cloth scraps, her testimony describes how Harrison Ashwood would drug his wives' evening wine with preparations made from local plants known for their psychoactive properties. The enslaved workers were forced to participate in the deception through their daily duties. They were required to rearrange furniture in the bedroom while the wives slept, creating the impression that objects had moved by themselves. They were ordered to deliver meals laced with mild hallucinogens that would cause confusion and disorientation. Most cruelly of all, they were commanded to spread false stories about previous wives who had lost their minds due to feminine weakness. Those who refused to participate or who attempted to warn the victims faced brutal punishment. The plantation records, discovered in the Sumter County Courthouse in 2022, detailed the sale of over 30 enslaved individuals from Ashwood Manor between 1848 and 1860, an unusually high turnover that reflected Harrison Ashwood's determination to eliminate witnesses. The local white community's willful blindness to the pattern was perhaps even more damning than Ashwood's deliberate cruelty. Church records from the period show that the Reverend William Patterson of Sumter County Presbyterian Church conducted funeral services for 3 of Ashwood's wives, each time attributing their deaths to nervous exhaustion or brain fever. His private diary, discovered in the church archives in 2024, reveals that he suspected the truth, but chose to remain silent. "I have heard whispers about the Ashwood bedroom," Reverend Patterson wrote in 1859, "but to speak against such a prominent family without absolute proof would destroy my ministry and accomplish nothing for the poor women who have suffered. I pray that God will bring justice in his own time." The pastor's moral cowardice, repeated by dozens of community leaders, created a wall of institutional protection around Harrison Ashwood. The breaking point came with the arrival of Ashwood's seventh wife, Elizabeth, in 1860. Unlike her predecessors, Elizabeth came from a prominent Charleston family with connections throughout the state's political and medical establishments. When she began exhibiting the familiar symptoms of psychological breakdown, her father, Judge Robert Caldwell, demanded a thorough investigation. Dr. Whitman saw his opportunity and provided Judge Caldwell with copies of his medical records documenting the pattern of mental collapse among Ashwood's wives. The judge's initial outrage quickly gave way to pragmatic calculation as he realized the scandal that would result from public exposure. Rather than demanding justice, he negotiated a quiet settlement that removed Elizabeth from the plantation and sealed the records under judicial order. Chapter 4. The Underground Network. The silencing of Judge Caldwell's investigation in 1860 marked a turning point in the dark history of Ashwood Manor, but it also revealed the existence of an underground network that had been quietly documenting the plantation's crimes for over a decade. This network, comprised primarily of enslaved women and a handful of sympathetic whites, had been collecting evidence and protecting witnesses despite enormous personal risk. At the center of this clandestine operation was Ruth, the enslaved healer whose coded records would eventually provide crucial testimony about Harrison Ashwood's systematic abuse of his wives. But Ruth was not working alone. Her network extended across 3 counties and included free blacks, Quaker families, and even a few white women who had grown suspicious of the pattern of deaths and disappearances at Ashwood Manor. The network's most valuable asset was Sarah Jenkins, a free black woman who worked as a seamstress in the town of Sumter and had connections throughout the region's network of domestic workers. Sarah's position allowed her to move freely between plantations and gather information from enslaved women who witnessed the abuse firsthand. Her detailed letters, written in code and hidden in the false bottom of her sewing basket, provided a comprehensive record of Harrison Ashwood's methods. According to Sarah's correspondence, discovered in 2024 in the walls of her former home, Ashwood had been perfecting his psychological torture techniques for years before his first marriage. He had reportedly practiced on enslaved women, using similar methods to break their spirits before selling them to distant plantations where they couldn't reveal his secrets. "The master tests his devil's work on our sisters before he uses it on his wives," Sarah wrote in 1857. "What he does to us, he will do to them, but they have families who might seek justice." The network's most dangerous operation involved smuggling evidence out of Ashwood Manor itself. Ruth had trained several young enslaved women to memorize details of the bedroom's hidden mechanisms and to note when equipment was modified or replaced. These women would then relay the information to Sarah during seemingly innocent encounters at the local market or church gatherings. One of these witnesses was Mary, a teenager who worked as a chambermaid and had been forced to assist in preparing the drugged wine that Harrison Ashwood used to incapacitate his wives. Mary's testimony, preserved in Ruth's coded records, describes how Ashwood would personally oversee the preparation of special drinks that contained extracts from plants grown in a hidden section of the plantation's garden. The garden itself was another element of Ashwood's elaborate deception. Located behind the slave quarters and invisible from the main house, it contained carefully cultivated plants known for their psychoactive properties: Jimson weed, angel's trumpet, and various fungi that could produce hallucinations and disorientation. The garden was tended by an enslaved man named Samuel, who had been trained in plant preparation by Ashwood himself. Samuel's forced participation in the scheme weighed heavily on his conscience, and he eventually became one of Ruth's most important sources of information. His detailed knowledge of the plants and their effects allowed the network to understand exactly how Ashwood was poisoning his wives. "Master makes me grow the devil's own medicines," Samuel confided to Ruth in 1858, "says I am the only one who knows the right way to prepare them for ladies' delicate constitution." The network's activities did not go unnoticed by Harrison Ashwood, who employed several enslaved men as informants to monitor the slave quarters for signs of rebellion or organized resistance. When he discovered that information was being leaked from the plantation, his response was swift and brutal. Between 1858 and 1860, over a dozen enslaved individuals were sold away from Ashwood Manor under suspicious circumstances. The most tragic case was that of Celia, the chambermaid who had attempted to warn Ashwood's second wife about the bedroom's dangers. After her sale to Louisiana, Celia managed to smuggle a single letter back to Ruth through the underground network. The letter, written on a scrap of cloth with charcoal, simply read, "Tell them the room has teeth. Tell them the walls eat women. Tell them my name was Celia." She was never heard from again. Despite the risks, the network continued to gather evidence throughout 1859 and 1860, building a comprehensive record of Ashwood's crimes. They documented not only the methods used to drive his wives insane, but also the broader system of corruption that protected him from consequences. Their records include detailed accounts of payments made to local officials, threats issued to potential witnesses, and the complex web of family connections that shielded Ashwood from investigation. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. The arrival of the Civil War in 1861 created chaos that temporarily disrupted Harrison Ashwood's carefully orchestrated system of psychological torture, but it also provided him with new opportunities to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. As Confederate forces mobilized throughout Alabama, many plantation owners used the wartime disruption to settle old scores and silence potential threats to their reputations. Dr. Marcus Whitman, whose hidden medical records had documented the pattern of abuse for over a decade, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. His attempts to interest federal authorities in investigating Ashwood Manor had gone nowhere, and the outbreak of war had eliminated any possibility of outside intervention. Worse still, he had begun to suspect that Ashwood knew about his secret documentation of the bedroom's victims. The physician's fears were confirmed in March 1862, when Harrison Ashwood confronted him directly about his inappropriate interest in family medical matters. According to Whitman's final diary entry, discovered with his other papers, Ashwood made it clear that the doctor's services were no longer required at the plantation. He spoke with the casual manner of a man discussing the weather, Whitman wrote, but his meaning was unmistakable. "I am to cease my investigations and destroy any records that might embarrass the family or face consequences that he did not need to specify." Whitman's response was to accelerate his documentation efforts, working frantically to record everything he had learned about the master bedroom's secrets before he was forced to leave the plantation. His final reports, hidden in the bedroom wall along with his other papers, provide the most detailed technical description of Ashwood's psychological warfare apparatus. The doctor had discovered additional mechanisms that previous investigations had missed, including a complex system of mirrors that could project images into the room from hidden alcoves. Meanwhile, Ruth and her network of enslaved witnesses faced their own crisis as the war disrupted the plantation's normal routines. Confederate conscription had removed many of the plantation's white overseers, placing greater pressure on the enslaved population to maintain order and productivity. This increased surveillance made it more difficult for the network to communicate and gather information, but it also created new opportunities to document Ashwood's crimes. With fewer white observers present, Ruth was able to conduct a thorough exploration of the master bedroom's hidden features. Her coded records describe the discovery of additional secret panels and the revelation that the bedroom's psychological torture system was even more elaborate than previously suspected. She found evidence that Ashwood had been experimenting with new methods of inducing madness, including the use of magnetic devices and electrical apparatus purchased from European suppliers. The war also brought new victims to Ashwood Manor, as Harrison Ashwood continued his pattern of marriage and psychological destruction, even amid the chaos of conflict. His eighth wife, Virginia, arrived in 1862 as federal forces were advancing through Alabama. Despite the ongoing military crisis, Ashwood was determined to continue his twisted experiments, perhaps driven by an obsession that had grown beyond any rational purpose. Virginia's case was particularly well documented because Ruth had by this time perfected her system of coded record-keeping and had trained multiple witnesses to observe and report on the bedroom's activities. The enslaved network's records show that Ashwood had become increasingly reckless in his methods, perhaps believing that the wartime chaos would prevent any investigation of his wife's inevitable mental collapse. The psychological torture of Virginia began immediately after her wedding night, following the same pattern that had destroyed 7 previous women. But this time, the network was prepared to intervene. Ruth had developed a plan to smuggle Virginia away from the plantation before Ashwood could complete his deadly work, using the underground railroad connections that had previously helped other enslaved people escape to freedom. The rescue attempt, planned for September 1862, represented the network's most ambitious and dangerous operation. It required coordination between multiple safe houses, the cooperation of several white abolitionists, and precise timing to avoid detection by Confederate patrols. Most critically, it depended on Virginia's willingness to trust enslaved women whose warnings about her husband's intentions must have seemed incredible. The plan ultimately failed when one of Ashwood's informants discovered the network's activities and reported them to Confederate authorities. The resulting crackdown was swift and merciless. Ruth was arrested and charged with inciting slave rebellion, a capital offense under Alabama law. Samuel, the enslaved man who had been forced to cultivate the psychoactive plants, was executed without trial. Over 20 other enslaved individuals from Ashwood Manor and surrounding plantations were sold to work camps in Georgia and Florida. Chapter 6. The Final Victim. If this story has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps Victims' Names' story reach more people. Virginia's fate, sealed by the failure of Ruth's rescue attempt, became the most thoroughly documented case of Harrison Ashwood's psychological terrorism. Unlike his previous victims, whose suffering had been recorded only in fragments and coded messages, Virginia's destruction was witnessed by multiple observers and preserved in detailed accounts that would eventually provide the key to understanding Ashwood's methods. The Confederate investigation into the slave rebellion at Ashwood Manor had inadvertently preserved much of the evidence that Ruth's network had gathered. Military authorities, focused on preventing slave uprisings that might aid federal forces, had confiscated and catalogued the network's coded records without understanding their true significance. These documents, stored in Confederate archives in Montgomery, survived the war and were rediscovered in 1924 during a historical research project. Dr. Whitman, despite his forced departure from the plantation, continued to monitor Virginia's condition through sources in the local medical community. His letters to colleagues describe his growing horror as he learned about the accelerated pace of her psychological deterioration. The patient's decline surpasses even the previous cases in its rapidity and severity, he wrote to a physician in Mobile. I fear the master has refined his methods to achieve maximum effect in minimum time. Virginia's treatment followed the established pattern, but with increased intensity and sophisticated techniques that Ashwood had perfected over 13 years of systematic abuse. The drugged wine was supplemented with other substances introduced through her food, her bathwater, and even the soap used to wash her clothing. The mechanical devices in the bedroom operated more frequently and with greater variability, creating an unpredictable environment that prevented her from adapting to the stimuli. Most cruelly, Ashwood had begun using information gathered from his previous victims to customize Virginia's psychological torture. He knew from experience which stimuli were most effective at inducing paranoia, which drugs produced the most distressing hallucinations, and which combinations of sensory manipulation could drive a woman to complete mental collapse in the shortest possible time. The enslaved women who survived the Confederate crackdown were forced to participate in Virginia's torture under threat of execution. Their testimonies, preserved in Ruth's coded records, describe the systematic nature of the psychological assault. Every aspect of Virginia's daily routine was designed to undermine her sanity. Her meals were served at irregular intervals to disrupt her sense of time. Her clothing was subtly altered each day to make her question her memory, and trusted servants were replaced without explanation to destroy her sense of continuity. The bedroom's hidden mechanisms were operated with scientific precision, following a schedule that Ashwood had developed based on his study of previous victims' responses. The midnight sounds began as barely audible whispers that gradually increased in volume and complexity. The optical illusions started as occasional flickers in her peripheral vision and evolved into persistent apparitions that seemed to interact with her directly. By December 1862, Virginia had begun exhibiting the classic symptoms of Ashwood's induced madness: severe insomnia, paranoid delusions, and a growing conviction that the house itself was alive and malevolent. Her letters to her family in Charleston, intercepted and preserved by Ashwood, document her desperate attempts to convince others of what was happening to her. "The walls speak at night," she wrote to her sister. "They tell me secrets about the women who came before me, and they promise I will join them soon." Virginia's family's response to her letters revealed the same pattern of denial and dismissal that had protected Ashwood's previous crimes. Her father attributed her fears to feminine nervousness and advised her to trust her husband's judgment about her medical care. Her sister suggested that pregnancy might be affecting her mental state, and recommended consultation with a physician who specialized in female complaints. The medical establishment's complicity in Virginia's destruction was perhaps more complete than in previous cases. Dr. Benjamin Crawford, who had replaced Whitman as the plantation's physician, was either incompetent or deliberately complicit in the abuse. His reports to Virginia's family described her condition as hereditary melancholia aggravated by the stresses of wartime, and he recommended continued isolation and rest cure treatments that actually facilitated Ashwood's psychological assault. The end came in February 1863, when Virginia was found wandering the plantation grounds in her nightgown, apparently attempting to dig up the slave cemetery with her bare hands. She claimed to be searching for the graves of Ashwood's previous wives, insisting that they had been buried there in secret. When restrained, she fought with extraordinary violence, screaming that the dead women were calling to her and demanding justice for their murders. Virginia was committed to the state asylum in Tuscaloosa within days of her breakdown, following the same path as Margaret Ashwood 15 years earlier. Unlike the previous cases, however, her commitment was witnessed by Confederate officers who had been investigating the slave rebellion. Their reports, preserved in military archives, provide an official record of her condition and the circumstances of her removal from Ashwood Manor. Chapter 7. The War's End and New Secrets. The collapse of the Confederacy in 1865 brought dramatic changes to Ashwood Manor, But it did not end Harrison Ashwood's reign of psychological terror. Federal occupation forces, focused on implementing Reconstruction policies and maintaining order in the defeated South, had little interest in investigating antebellum domestic crimes, even when presented with evidence of systematic abuse. The plantation's enslaved population, now legally free but economically trapped by the sharecropping system that replaced slavery, found themselves in an ambiguous position regarding the secrets they had been forced to keep. Many of Ruth's network had been scattered by the Confederate crackdown of 1862, but those who remained faced a difficult choice: seek justice for the crimes they had witnessed, or maintain their silence to protect their precarious new freedom. Samuel's son, who had inherited his father's knowledge of the psychoactive plants and their preparation, made the decision to preserve the evidence for future generations. Working with the few survivors of Ruth's network, he created a detailed record of Ashwood's methods, including botanical specimens, written descriptions of the bedroom's mechanical devices, and testimonies from enslaved witnesses. These materials were hidden in the foundation of the old slave quarters, where they remained undisturbed for over 150 years. Meanwhile, Harrison Ashwood, now in his 60s but apparently undeterred by age or changing circumstances, began planning for a 9th marriage. His choice was particularly calculating: Rebecca Morrison, a young widow whose husband had died in the war and who had no family connections in Alabama to protect her. The marriage, which took place in 1866, represented Ashwood's determination to continue his psychological experiments, despite the risks posed by the new political order. Dr. Whitman, who had spent the war years documenting soldiers' medical conditions for Confederate forces, returned to the region in 1867 and immediately began investigating Rebecca's treatment at Ashwood Manor. His post-war correspondence reveals that Ashwood had further refined his methods, incorporating techniques he had learned from observing the psychological effects of combat trauma on Confederate soldiers. The bedroom's mechanisms had been updated with new devices purchased from northern suppliers who were eager to sell their products in the recovering South. These included more sophisticated optical equipment, improved chemical delivery systems, and acoustic devices that could produce a wider range of disturbing sounds. Ashwood had also begun experimenting with electromagnetic apparatus that he believed could directly affect the human nervous system. Rebecca's destruction followed the now familiar pattern, but with innovations that reflected Ashwood's growing sophistication and cruelty. The psychological assault began before the wedding, with Ashwood arranging for Rebecca to visit the master bedroom during their courtship. He told her romantic stories about previous occupants while subtly activating some of the room's gentler mechanisms, beginning the process of conditioning her to accept increasingly disturbing experiences as normal. The freed blacks who worked at the plantation under sharecropping agreements found themselves in an impossible position. They knew what was happening to Rebecca, but their economic survival depended on Ashwood's goodwill. Federal authorities, overwhelmed by the challenges of Reconstruction, were unlikely to believe their testimonies against a white landowner. The old networks of resistance and documentation had been broken, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. Despite these obstacles, some witnesses attempted to alert outside authorities about Rebecca's treatment. Mary, the former chambermaid who had survived the 1862 crackdown, wrote a detailed letter to the Freedmen's Bureau describing the bedroom's secrets and Ashwood's pattern of abuse. Her letter, preserved in Bureau archives, was forwarded to a federal investigator who dismissed it as the fantasies of an ignorant Negro woman seeking to defame her former master. The federal government's failure to investigate these allegations reflected broader patterns of neglect and racism that characterized Reconstruction policies. Northern officials, eager to restore economic productivity in the South, were reluctant to pursue cases that might disrupt the region's agricultural recovery. the rights and testimonies of formerly enslaved people were routinely dismissed, even when they provided detailed evidence of ongoing crimes. Rebecca's mental breakdown, which began in earnest in late 1867, was observed by several white neighbors who had grown suspicious of the pattern of deaths and disappearances at Ashwood Manor. Unlike previous cases, however, these witnesses were emboldened by the changing political climate to voice their concerns more openly. Their testimonies, preserved in local court records, provided the first official white acknowledgement of problems at the plantation. The breakthrough came when Rebecca's condition became so severe that she began making public accusations against her husband during a Sunday church service. Her dramatic collapse in front of the entire congregation, during which she described the bedroom's hidden mechanisms and accused Ashwood of systematic poisoning, could not be dismissed as private family business. The scandal forced local authorities to at least appear to investigate her claims. Chapter 8. The investigation that almost was the public nature of Rebecca's breakdown in 1868 created the first real possibility that Harrison Ashwood's crimes might face official scrutiny. Unlike his previous victims, who had been quietly removed from public view at the first signs of mental distress, Rebecca had managed to voice her accusations before a congregation that included several influential community members who could not easily dismiss her testimony. Judge William Matthews, recently appointed to the county court by federal authorities, found himself under pressure to investigate Rebecca's claims. Unlike the antebellum judges who had protected Ashwood through willful blindness, Matthews had no personal connections to the plantation owner and was answerable to Reconstruction officials who were theoretically committed to justice for all citizens, regardless of race or gender. The investigation began promisingly, with Matthews ordering a thorough examination of Ashwood Manor and interviews with current and former residents. Dr. Whitman, now elderly but still sharp, was called as an expert witness and finally had the opportunity to present his detailed medical records documenting the pattern of psychological abuse. His testimony, preserved in court transcripts, provided the first official acknowledgement of Ashwood's systematic crimes. Former enslaved residents of the plantation were also called to testify, marking the first time their voices had been heard in a legal proceeding. Mary, the former chambermaid, gave detailed testimony about the bedroom's hidden mechanisms and the methods used to drug Ashwood's wives. Samuel's son provided botanical evidence of the psychoactive plants that had been cultivated specifically for use in the psychological torture sessions. The physical examination of the master bedroom, conducted by federal investigators in the presence of court officials, confirmed many of the witnesses' claims. The hidden panels were discovered along with some of the mechanical devices used to create sounds and movements. Chemical residues found in the room's ventilation system provided evidence of the substances that had been used to poison the air supply. For a brief moment, it appeared that justice might finally be served. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were credible, and the federal government had both the authority and the stated commitment to prosecute crimes that had been ignored by antebellum authorities. Local newspapers reported on the investigation with sensational headlines that suggested Ashwood's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. But Harrison Ashwood had not survived 15 years of systematic murder by being unprepared for eventual exposure. His response to the investigation was swift, sophisticated, and ultimately successful. Working through intermediaries, he began a campaign to discredit the witnesses and undermine the investigation itself. The attack on the witnesses focused on their credibility and motivations. Ashwood's lawyers argued that the former enslaved residents were seeking revenge against their former master and could not be trusted to provide truthful testimony. Rebecca's accusations were dismissed as the ravings of a mentally ill woman whose condition was the result of hereditary weakness rather than deliberate abuse. More significantly, Ashwood used his remaining wealth and political connections to pressure federal officials to abandon the investigation. His arguments were carefully crafted to appeal to northern prejudices and priorities. Prosecuting a southern landowner based on the testimony of former slaves and mentally ill women would set a dangerous precedent that might destabilize the entire reconstruction effort. The turning point came when Ashwood's lawyers produced medical testimony from northern physicians who argued that the symptoms exhibited by his wives were consistent with hereditary mental illness rather than induced madness. These expert witnesses, who had never examined any of the victims, provided scientific-sounding explanations for the pattern of psychological breakdowns that completely ignored the physical evidence of deliberate torture. Judge Matthews, facing pressure from his federal superiors and lacking the political support necessary to pursue such a controversial case, began to waver in his commitment to the investigation. The final blow came when Rebecca herself, possibly under the influence of renewed drugging or simply broken by the stress of the proceedings, recanted her accusations and claimed that her previous statements had been the product of mental illness. By late 1868, the investigation had effectively collapsed. The physical evidence was dismissed as circumstantial. The witness testimony was ruled unreliable, and Rebecca was quietly committed to a private asylum in North Carolina, where she died 2 years later under mysterious circumstances. Harrison Ashwood, who had briefly faced the possibility of justice, emerged from the scandal with his reputation damaged but his freedom intact. Chapter 9. Legacy of Silence. The failure of the 1868 investigation marked the final victory of Harrison Ashwood's system of psychological terror, but it also ensured that his crimes would remain hidden for more than a century. The official records were sealed, the witnesses were scattered or silenced, and the master bedroom at Ashwood Manor continued to harbor its deadly secrets as the plantation gradually fell into decay and abandonment. Harrison Ashwood lived until 1891, dying at the age of 89 without ever facing consequences for the systematic torture and murder of at least 9 women. His death was noted in local newspapers with respectful obituaries that praised him as a pillar of the antebellum community and made no mention of the decades of abuse that had occurred under his roof. The master bedroom was sealed after his death, but the secrets it contained remained buried in the walls. The plantation house itself stood empty for decades, becoming the subject of local ghost stories and folklore that contained distorted echoes of the truth. Neighbors reported strange sounds coming from the abandoned building, and occasional visitors claimed to see figures moving in the windows of the sealed master bedroom. These stories, dismissed by rational observers as superstition, actually represented the persistence of community memory about the horrors that had occurred within those walls. The property changed hands several times during the early 20th century, but no subsequent owner was willing to occupy the main house for extended periods. The master bedroom, in particular, seemed to repel occupants, with several reporting disturbing dreams, unexplained noises, and a general sense of malevolent presence. Most assumed these experiences were the result of suggestion and old stories, never suspecting that they might be encountering the lingering effects of Harrison Ashwood's psychological warfare apparatus. The truth might have remained buried forever, if not for the 2024 renovation project that uncovered Dr. Whitman's hidden papers. The discovery prompted a comprehensive investigation that finally revealed the full scope of Ashwood's crimes and the systematic cover-up that had protected him for over 150 years. Historians and forensic experts working together were able to piece together the complete story from multiple sources of evidence. The archaeological excavation of the former slave quarters yielded additional confirmation of the witnesses' accounts. Samuel Son's carefully preserved botanical specimens were still identifiable, and the hidden records provided detailed corroboration of the testimony that had been dismissed in 1868. Chemical analysis of soil samples from the master bedroom confirmed the presence of the psychoactive substances that had been used to drug Ashwood's victims. Modern psychological experts Reviewing the historical records have confirmed that Ashwood's methods were sophisticated enough to induce genuine mental illness in previously healthy individuals. His systematic approach to psychological torture, while primitive by contemporary standards, was effective precisely because it was sustained over extended periods and combined multiple forms of sensory manipulation with chemical substances that disrupted normal brain function. The discovery has prompted broader research into the experiences of women in antebellum society and the ways in which domestic abuse was concealed and enabled by social and legal institutions. Historians now recognize that Ashwood's crimes, while extreme in their methodology, were part of a broader pattern of violence against women that was systematically ignored and covered up by a society that valued property rights over human rights. The descendants of the enslaved witnesses who tried to expose Ashwood's crimes have finally been vindicated by the historical record. Their ancestors' courage in documenting and preserving evidence despite enormous personal risk has made it possible for the truth to emerge and for the victims to be properly remembered. Ruth's network of resistance and documentation serves as a powerful example of how oppressed people fought back against injustice, even when official channels offered no hope of redress. Subscribe to the channel to learn about more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of Ashwood Manor. We'll see you in the next video. Epilogue. The master bedroom at Ashwood Manor stands empty now, its secrets finally exposed to the light after more than 150 years of darkness. The hidden mechanisms have been removed, the secret panels opened, and the chemical residues neutralized. But the memory of what occurred within those walls serves as a reminder that the past's buried truths have a way of surfacing, demanding acknowledgement and justice, even across the vast expanse of time. In the end, the silence was broken not by official investigation or institutional courage, but by the persistence of those who refused to let the truth die with them. The women who suffered and the enslaved people who witnessed their suffering left traces of their experiences that survived long enough to speak for them when they no longer could. Their voices, finally heard, ensure that Harrison Ashwood's crimes will be remembered as a warning about the deadly consequences of unchecked power and willful blindness to systematic abuse. The truth, as painful as it may be, is always preferable to the comfortable lies that protect the guilty and silence the innocent.